Good morning, colleagues. Please keep your mics off. We will start at about 10. Your mics and your videos should be off, and we'll start around 10. Good morning, everyone. All protocol observed. Thank you for joining us today under the MBDA Conversations series. My name is Asi Pem Khalisa, and I will be facilitating today's discussion. Allow me to take this chance also to welcome you all, including those joining us on social media platforms of the MBDA, as well as on different radio stations, which I will mention later on. Today's discussion looks at circular economy, focusing on developing, understanding, and unpacking the African circular economy, a conversation that is largely needed as we work towards restoring the African economy. This discussion taking place in South Africa today comes at a time when we are facing high levels of unemployment, poverty, inequality, water scarcity, and facing an energy crisis since 2007. Well, there has been a repairing as well as reuse driven largely by the informal sector. It is thus important for us to share insights into some of the initiatives already in place to catalyze not only South Africa's transition to a more circular economy, but that of Africa, to address issues of scarce resources as well as security concerns. Well, colleagues, we are all looking forward to this powerful game-changing conversation. To run a smooth engagement, we would like to request all of you to please keep your mics and videos off. The chat section is open for comments and questions, which we will engage after the presentation or in between the presentation. You can also send your questions or voice notes via WhatsApp by texting 072 423 0271. 072 423 0271. I will be posting the number so that you can be able to chat throughout the engagement. We are also live on PFM, Ngubela FM, Islam FM, on Facebook, as well as on YouTube. For Facebook, kindly follow Mandela Bay Development Agency, and on YouTube, it is Mandela Bay Development Agency /MBDA. Let us spread this conversation on our social media platforms by using hashtag MBDA Conversations as we engage. Well, without wasting any time, I will now introduce to you the host as well as the main speaker of today, Mr. Chris Whyte, who is an expert in the field of circular economy and is the founding director of the African Circular Economy Network, as well as the ACEN Foundation. Chris focuses on developing, understanding and unpacking the circular economy throughout Africa. Moreover, as the founder and managing director of USEIT from 2009 to 2020, Chris' role was to establish the business model of this non-profit organization with the public and private sector in creating a mechanism that assists in unlocking and implementing key recycling projects. In the 11 years, Chris was at the helm of USEIT. His team facilitated the creation of almost 2,600 jobs, saved more than 4 times the funding received in landfill diversion, and left almost 10 times the funding in project developments, winning local and national awards as well as 6 global awards. Colleagues, again, may I please ask everyone, all the participants, to please keep their mics and videos off. As far as academic qualifications are concerned, Chris holds an MSc in Geographic Information from the University of London, a BSc Honours in Geology from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, among many other academic accolades. Well, it is an honor to be around such an interlocutor as well as a global change maker. Without wasting any time, colleagues and friends, allow me to call upon Chris to do his presentation. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you so much for that marvelous introduction. It makes me sound a lot more important than I actually am. I am one of many very passionate people who run the African Circular Economy Network. I'm not one of the original founders, but I'm certainly one of the directors, and I've been involved for since its inception. But what I want to try and do today is get across a number of different concepts to the audience. We will engage as described through the chat boxes and through WhatsApp and other media. But what we want to try and do today is we want to try and address the opportunities in circular economy in Africa. So in terms of who I am, as mentioned, I am a director of the African Circular Economy Network. I was the chapter lead for South Africa for a couple of years. We now have a great team running that. But we then established the ASIN Foundation, also to provide a bit of meat around the bones with regards to the African Circular Economy Network, driving funding and opportunities through the European Union and other funders. And what we do there is we create opportunities through our partner members, either country representatives or chapter leads in the different African countries. We currently have 31 African countries in our database and over 4,000 followers across Africa. So the foundation really is to try and bring more opportunity around that. But just to show you that I'm also involved with a number of other things. So I have several other companies, Sustainable Tech and Pyrolysis Group on the energy and sustainability side, SDG Africa on the empowerment opportunities, as well as looking at the Use It, which I was part of from 2009 to 2020. And then other groups that I have internationally, Green Waste X and Green Agri X, based in Mauritius. So there are a number of different applications. I don't believe purely in the academic profile. I believe in action on the ground. So as discussed, we have helped through Use It, create nearly 2,650 jobs over that period. And these are very simple applications that we can bring into anywhere in Africa. So in terms of what we have a problem. If we look at South Africa, or even if we look at any developing country, the picture in the bottom left is the Citron River in Manila, which makes us look like angels compared to what's happening there. But we have massive problems in terms of our waste management in and across Africa. And these are pictures that we're all very much used to. The reality is that if we look in the developed economies, we're not alone. Whether you're in Hawaii or California or Norway, we all have the same problem. The issue is trying to understand where it comes from and what we do with it. And we need to look at, instead of the problem, we need to look at the opportunities. So if we focus on one waste stream to try and get this conversation going, let's have a look at plastic. Plastic is always the bad bear. The reality is that if you look at plastic in terms of the waste stream, it is municipal waste is about 30% of our total waste in the country, and plastic is only about 30% of that stream. But it is the most visible, so it's always perceived as the bad one. But there are great opportunities around that. So what we can do is we can prevent waste. We can say no to plastic. We can ban plastics. That's not realistic. The simple reality is that if we look at plastics production, internationally, I think there's something in the region of $250 billion have been invested in new plastic manufacture, which is going to increase production of plastics by 40% over the next decade. And that's the reality. Plastics is not going to go away. But we can look at reducing plastics. We can ban certain types of plastics. So, for example, there are countries that have banned plastic bags. We used to call these the national flower in South Africa. We still have a massive problem with them, but we do have a system to deal with the plastic bags. So we can ban plastics, but we can also design better. However, if you look at some of the design, for example, if you take the PET bottles, over the last sort of 20 years or so, a soft drink would have about 23 grams or 24 grams of PET in the container. That is reduced to about 9 grams. What that essentially means is that you still get the same bottle, but the producers are using a lot less plastic. Unfortunately, this benefits the packaging industry as opposed to the consumer. And unfortunately, regardless of the thickness of that plastic, you're still going to end up killing turtles and other problems. So while the developing economy industries are cashing in on a bad thing, we see this all over the place. I'm not going to mention names, but there are certain ocean shoes that you can get, and recovered ocean plastic sunglasses that you can buy. You might be able to buy them. I can't afford them. These are high value items that really are not on my shopping list at all. But what it does do is it starts to bring in certain knowledge and understanding of what the issues are, but it's not going to tackle the real problems. We know where it's coming from. So the reality is that if you look at the work that's been done internationally by the likes of Professor Jambek, we know where the main sources of the plastic are, and it's largely in developing nations. South Africa, unfortunately, we are ranked, I think, 11th in the world in terms of our plastic leakage into the ocean, which is not somewhere I would like to see us saying we're 11th in the world and something. This is not a good one. So we want to ensure that we look at solutions and opportunities. But the reality is that in Africa, we don't need shoes and sunglasses. What we need is we need education, we need health, infrastructure, jobs, food, energy. These are the critical components that we need towards creating a sustainable future. So the way forward for Africa essentially is that we need to put away the begging bowl. We need to stop looking to the north in terms of opportunities to bail us out of this problem. We need to look at our own local solutions. What works here in Africa does not always work with the European or American type technologies. So we can't take a developed world application and put it into a developing economy. And the reason is that we have substantially different socioeconomic dynamics, particularly in terms of understanding the infrastructure, the resources, and the systems of developed nations. We cannot look at these in the same light. What we do have is that we have the need, the desire, the skills, and the innovative drive and ability to bring solutions that will work in Africa. And there are many, many examples of this. So some of the work that we're doing, for example, with Footprints Africa, you will see nearly 500 case studies of great circular economy opportunities in Africa. We need to unlock these value chains. We need to create products, and we need to cater for our rapidly expanding population. And that will also be assisted through driving green procurement and local production. We have all of the innovation and the solutions for all wastes right here. So do we need foreign investment in international technologies? Well, yes, I think the opportunities are there. But more importantly, what I would like to see is mainstreaming of financial investment into sustainable applications and technologies locally. There's a lot of talk that's going on at government, but we're not seeing much action. For example, if you want to try and take a bank loan for R1 million, it's going to be a lot easier if I'm trying to bake biscuits for the local population, because a banker understands a biscuit. You have the ingredients, you manufacture it, people eat it, you finance it. When you start talking about innovative technologies and applications that are not mainstream, then the financial sector seems to fall apart around that. So in order to drive that, we also need the legislative and regulatory frameworks to stop hindering local innovation. We are an incredible nation of innovators, and I can mention a dozen applications off the top of my head where we have got some of the most amazing innovators who are now working in Europe or Asia or America. And we need to try and keep our innovation and our technology locally. We also need producers to take real responsibility for their actions. And we'll discuss that in a little bit more detail with regards to extended producer responsibility. But we also need to create markets. And this is where supply chain management and material specifications are vitally important. If we understand what the solutions and opportunities are, it will allow us to look at the opportunities to create the market and create the drive and the demand to ensure that new products and materials enter into the system. It's not complicated. So in looking at transitioning to a circular economy, particularly where waste is a resource, is not just about recycling. Unfortunately, the general perception of recycling is a pretty naive view that we have. I always use this picture to the right. Any of us who've had kids or who have children, when they go to preschool, pretty much every one of them is going to make one of these little elephants out of a 2-liter milk bottle. So when I talk about recycling, it's not just about arts and crafts. So if you think recycling is irrelevant, then you need to change that mindset. And that's where we need to look at that thinking and understand the impacts and outcomes of waste as a resource. We need to change the narrative. We've got to stop focusing on recycling. For years and years, people have called me the recycling guy, and it just annoys me because it is just such a tiny component of what we do. We need to look at the opportunity in terms of using waste as a resource that delivers on the following applications: social upliftment, skills development, economic development, energy, water and wastewater, infrastructure and housing, manufacturing, food security, climate change. And to that, you could probably also add issues around health and education. So developing a waste economy will allow us to achieve our SDGs. And those of you who are unaware of the Sustainable Development Goals, this is a global initiative where we have a number of these 17 different goals that we need to strive towards to create a sustainable future for us all. So let's look at education. Here's a prime example. Recycling actually holds one of the greatest solutions to poor education in developing economies. A lot of what we miss out on in our education sector is early childhood development. And the reality is that 80% of a child's brain potential in terms of their numeracy and literacy skills is developed by the age of 4 years old. And the reality is that we don't give our kids enough stimulation to develop those skills at that young age. There are organizations locally that focus on this. One is Singakwenza, a fantastic non-profit organization, I think headquartered in KwaZulu-Natal. And they do amazing stuff in terms of teaching aids and tools with the simple resources that are available to you. We also need to look at issues around health, nutrition, and food security. One of the projects we're doing at the moment is we are working with the Dutch government to drive the development of a circular economy platform for South Africa. When we started off this project, it coincided with the massive riots that we had in particularly KZN, but also in Gauteng. And it brought to light a critical issue in terms of the divisions and the divides between the haves and the have-nots. People are starving. People don't have jobs. People are desperate. And the simple reality is that we've created a system where we're no longer reliant on ourselves. We no longer know what food security is. Food security is not waiting for your grant at the end of the month. Food security should be about growing it. It should be about addressing your own nutritional needs. So these are all components that are available. There's amazing work that's being done locally by groups like MBDA, Farming Organics, another KZN-based institute that I've been working with for a long time. Non-Client LaJoy is the founder and driver behind that, and my Zulu wife. We get along really, really well. And she looks at the entire system, everything from the soil to the water, looking at the materials one uses, understanding the limitations of local communities with regards to the growing potential that they have. And she has developed the MBDA system, which is not just about growing plants organically. It's also about working in with school kids to become seedpreneurs, so they start becoming involved in the seed supply chain. It's about looking at the recirculation of the products from a nutrient recycling perspective. She works with vermiculture and compost, and also drives and develops a number of different products through agri-processing. So once you've created the product, how do we then look at increasing the value through vertical integration? So instead of selling a cabbage for 5 Rand a cabbage, how do you convert that cabbage into a 60 Rand item by processing it into pickles and sauerkraut, or looking at juices, wines and sauces that her team is creating. So there's massive opportunities in the food system, and we've just lost the plot as to how to actually do that. We can also look at recycling building materials or replacing existing building materials with recycled products. So some of the stuff that we worked on locally, for example, roof tiles made out of waste plastic and sand. Tires can be processed into shingles for highly thermally efficient roofing systems. Glass recycling can be converted into aggregates, water filtration medium into glass counters. We've used problematic electronic waste plastics to convert that into guttering systems. Old paper packets, plastic packets that are going into piping and conduiting. So there's a number of different opportunities where we can convert new products from waste that was going to landfill that creates jobs and offsets imports. And there's a number of different opportunities around this. So if we look at the application in construction materials, we can look at the very simple sort of extruded and compacted type products that we can use for pavers, furniture, social infrastructure, fence posts and poles, boardwalks, decking, fencing and others. So there's no real reason why we can't look at these different applications. There's a number of products that we're looking at now. I'm working with a group in Ghana and Vietnam, for example, on a new product development that uses the contaminated mixed plastics coming off of beach cleanups and river capture systems to create boarding systems that are used in permanent structures. There are so many different applications. If we look at it for road infrastructure, this is a massive, massive application and opportunity. Some of you may have heard of, there was a lot of media in terms of the first plastic road in Jeffreys Bay. The reality is this was done by a Scottish company called MacGreber, and the product was actually imported from Scotland. So the waste was imported from Scotland for a 1 kilometer section. The reality is that I've been personally involved with groups locally where we've been building South African design and developed plastic roads for the last 4 or 5 years, and very few people know about it. But the opportunity is that we can look at both dry and hot melt systems that will take up to 45% mixed plastics into the structure. And these create cheaper, stronger, and better roads. There's a pothole mix that's been developed now that it's virtually indestructible. And that's something we would like to be able to try and create from an enterprise development perspective, where pothole mix can be generated using local aggregate and local plastics and solve a lot of the maintenance problems that we have in our towns. But we need to look at solving waste issues with proven and affordable technologies. We mentioned before some of the applications in terms of the European technologies. There are some great systems out there, but they are largely unaffordable and impractical in terms of local applications. So some of the stuff that you're seeing here, for example, this unit in the top right is a small-scale pyrolysis and refinery system that we developed in KZN. And this highly successful program was able to convert the problematic plastics from a recycling facility into diesel that ran all of the recycling infrastructure for that for that institution. And we did that for 6 months very successfully. And unfortunately, we were closed down by environmental affairs again, because legislation and regulation are just not aligned with technology and applications. As part of that, we also developed systems to drive really dirty plastics and things using waste glass in a mix, 50-50 mix, to create blocks, pavers, bricks, retaining blocks, curbstones, and this sort of thing. Now, the opportunity there is absolutely enormous. If we look at just the paving units, in South Africa, with the different municipalities, we use in the region of 8 million paving stones a year for new infrastructure and upgrades and maintenance. And that equates, if we converted that into the ocean paver paving stones, that would suck up around about 100,000 tons of waste plastic and probably create in the region of 5,000 to 8,000 jobs across the country. And so there's a lot of opportunities, and that's one tiny product in a massive scheme of infrastructure and development. However, energy is the big one. In South Africa, we are not as badly off as the rest of the world, rest of Africa, but we need to look at recovering energy on the plastics and the wastes that we can't recycle or that are not currently recycled. And the simple reality is that Africa is energy poor. If you look at South Africa, in the 2018-2019 year, Eskom sold about 209,000 gigawatt hours into for sale for the consumers. And that's in South Africa with a population of 59 million people. The entire energy generation capacity over in Africa, 54 different countries in that same period, was 700,000 gigawatt hours. And that's with a population of 1.4 billion people. Now remember, this population is set to increase by up to 2.5 billion people by 2050. All of those people are going to need energy, they're going to need housing, we're going to need roads, infrastructure, and jobs. And the reality is that Africa largely runs on liquid fuels for energy. If you go anywhere in Africa, those of you who have traveled will know the hum of the generators, and that's really what keeps things going. But that's a hugely expensive energy component. Now, if you look at that in reality, South Africa has then 30% of Africa's generation capacity. Now, that's obviously when it's working. I'm currently sitting in the middle of load shedding right now. So who knows what the actual capacity is. But in terms of our installed capacity, we have 30% of the generation capacity of Africa. South Africa has only got 3% of China's generation capacity.
No,
sorry, can we mute somebody there?
Okay, thank you for...
Somebody's talking? So South Africa has 3% of China's generation capacity. New York, not just New York City, but New York State, has half of the whole of Africa's energy generation capacity. South Korea has 3 times South Africa's generation capacity. And it's only 12% the size of South Africa and has a smaller population of about 51 million people. So when you put it into perspective, energy really is the critical issue. And the simple reality is that energy is the basis of all secondary development in Africa. We cannot develop secondary recycling or materials beneficiation without energy. We cannot develop manufacturing, food processing, water management, wastewater management, communications, education, industry or social infrastructure without energy. Energy is the critical key to all of these different opportunities. So even with the work, for example, that the African Circular Economy Network is doing currently in Rwanda, so we're busy working on circular food systems in Rwanda, 30 to 40% of post-harvest losses in the agricultural sector are largely related to energy, because we don't have cold storage facilities in the rural areas to get those products into the markets. So energy is critical in all aspects. So the reality is we need to get this before it gets into the sea. So what I'm going to try and do then is break this into two different sections. So one is looking at those opportunities, but then understanding the circular economy, and we'll try and break that down. If there's any questions at this stage, I'm happy to engage them now, or if you would like me just to continue, then I'm happy to continue.
Hi, Chris. We do have a question on the chats. Coming from Freddie. I don't know if Freddie would like to come in, or should I read it for Chris?
I'm happy for you to read it.
Okay, thanks, Freddie. So Freddie is saying, thank you, Chris, for such an amazing presentation. My name is Freddie Mashate, and I work with South Africa's National Science Festival. What do you perceive to be the role of young people in contributing towards a sustainable circular economy? And do you believe that Africa has the necessary competitive infrastructure to encourage young people to be innovative in this space? Yes.
There's a huge opportunity there, Freddie, and this is where we need to change our thinking. And a lot of that is aligned to looking at circular practices, particularly around issues on energy, water, and food security. So there's a critical component around what we call water, energy, food nexus, or the WEF nexus. And the youth can play an enormous role in that. I often, years ago, used to go and do a lot of presentations at some of the rural schools in KZN. And it was always very difficult, because here's this Mlungu who's now going into a rural area to talk about recycling, and you can see that the kids are just not interested. It's like, here's another exercise in futility. But when you start to get them to understand the real solutions that are at their fingertips, that they don't see because they don't understand it, they've never been exposed to the opportunity where they can start to look at practical applications where they can change their own lives. So when you start to talk to the youth in terms of how they can empower themselves, there are so many opportunities in the circular economy. And that's really where we need to get it to. But a lot of that, unfortunately, is also about trying to change the narrative with government. We need to transition our economies to break down this inequality. We have probably one of the most unequal societies in the world in terms of the difference between the haves and the have-nots. And the opportunities, because the value chains or the supply chains are largely controlled in the hands of the few. But how do we bring the masses into the supply chain? And that's where we need to change those statistics. So circular economy, for example, in food is not about importing avocados from Israel. It's about looking at supporting local applications, creating market opportunities and applications in food processing and marketing generation. We need to source our food locally. We need to source our food in a healthy process. It needs to be organic. So the opportunity is there to engage supply chains where we can look at youth and the communities becoming critical in that supply chain right across the spectrum, from water to energy to food to infrastructure to building materials. And this is where those opportunities lie. And we have not even scratched the surface in terms of unlocking that opportunity. So if you look at things like energy, that pyrolysis system that I showed you, the opportunity is that, we could distribute that system. It's a small scale system that would process 600 kilograms of plastic a day. We could distribute over 1,000 of those units across Africa. That would offset hundreds of thousands of tons of plastic. They would then create a fuel that would offset 40 to 50 billion rands worth of imports every year. And then your communities become suppliers. So you have the collectors who benefit from that and will get paid for the collecting of the process. You can have those that process it, and then we sell it into the system. But then it offsets those imports. The same example with the ocean pavers. If you look at one example, eThekwini municipality alone uses over 1 million paving stones, 1 million paving stones a year. They use about another 1.2 million retaining blocks, over 5 million paving blocks. If we could tap into 30% of that by generating opportunities with communities as suppliers into that system, using local resources, the benefits are just enormous. So it's a great question. We know what to do, Freddie, but we need to do it.
Wow, thank you so much, Chris. I see there's more engagement coming up on the chats, and I've also noted Zoliswa's hand. But just before giving over to you, Zoliswa, to ask your question or state your comment, I'd like to read one other question that comes from Tanduxolo Ngubelanga. I'm saying, what a pity. NMBM once engaged on a waste to energy project that was stopped on its tracks. I am sure by now we would have addressed some of the challenges that are coming out of this presentation. So thanks, Chris. This is good. I think Zoliswa will just come in to read the comment on the chats and also the question that Zoliswa might have. Over to you, Zoliswa.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It's very informative. And my concern is the concept is good and it's benefiting a lot of solutions towards the SDGs, and it's not only one. There is a lack of funding. I'll make an example of the company that is closed down in East London that has started the plastic recycling, where one can get funding for that, because a lot of people have lost jobs.
Good question. Funding is always an issue, and I think this is where we need to understand if we look at creating bankability or the financial feasibility of any particular application. We need to look at two different things. One is understanding where that finance comes from. So conventional recycling, it's almost impossible to get commercial funding for that. The risks are too high. Recycling by itself, unfortunately, as I mentioned, there's a very naive view. We tend to cherry pick the high value products out of that, and we store them, we separate them, we bale them, and we sell them. So your value chain is very short. There's no secondary processing. So we need to look at the secondary processing side of things to create the market and understand those opportunities. We need to look at the alternative technologies that create value in all the waste streams so that we avoid the cherry picking. And conventional finance needs to start driving these opportunities, but the blockages are related to legislation and regulation. And unlocking those different applications would have a massive impact. The opportunity in terms of understanding implementation of a modern technology versus the current status quo. It's just too easy and too cheap for landfill. And the reality of that is that we're probably only looking at about 50% of our waste that's actually collected and goes to landfill nationally. So we're doing a terrible job at that. And it's because there's no value in it. And often it comes back to the same issue around the haves versus the have-nots. You take an area like Mandela Bay district municipality. If you look at the, you probably got 3% of the population who are at 50% of the income of the area. And then you have probably 60% of the population that have the remaining 10%. Those dynamics are really killing us, and we keep driving that. But if we look at the opportunities through municipalities to create value chains and demand by looking at procurement for different products, we can start to create those opportunities. So now if you went to a financer and you said, okay, I'm not just collecting PET, I'm selling that. What we've got to remember is that that number goes up and down. I mean, if you look at where we were at the beginning of 2021, we were getting R1.60 a kilogram for PET. It's now up to R8 a kilogram because supply and demand. That kills the small recyclers. So recycling, in terms of our naive perception of recycling, is not the silver bullet that's going to make things work. We have to look at secondary processing and adding value. And if we can do that by creating an offtake, then everything is fundable. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you.
Hi, Chris. We don't have any further questions. Colleagues, remember to post your questions here or post it on WhatsApp. I've stated the number to send your voice notes or questions on WhatsApp. I think, Chris, we can continue to the second part. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you. Right, so now we need to get to understanding the circular economy. So the first thing we need to do is to ask, what is the circular economy? And there's many different interpretations of this. If you remember where circular economy came from, I've been in this game for a long time, long before it was called circular economy. It's been called recycling, regenerative, restorative, cradle to cradle, cradle to grave, sustainable, green. So now apparently I'm a circular economy expert. Who knows what I'm going to be called next year? Somebody will come up with a new term. But the concepts of circular economy are important. We need to listen to that. Now, if you look at some of these standard things, Wikipedia, for example, states, and I quote, "A circular economy is a regenerative system in which resource inputs and waste, emissions, and energy leakage are minimized by slowing, closing, and narrowing energy material loops. This can be achieved through long-lasting design, maintenance, repair, reuse, remanufacturing, refurbishing, and closed recycling loops. In contrast to a linear economy, which is take, make, and dispose." So when you read that, we say, right, have we got this tape? Do we know what a circular economy is? No, we don't. So we need to unpack it further. Now remember, the circular economy, from my perspective, is not so much about the resources side of it. It's about the outcomes and the impacts from a multi-sectoral perspective. What are those outcomes and impacts in terms of infrastructure, manufacturing, tourism, education, health, infrastructure, agriculture? That's where we need to look at the focus areas. So let's try and unpack it a little bit further. Now, anybody who's been involved in circular economy will recognize this drawing. It's what we call the butterfly diagram from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And what this does is it separates out the components from the technical and versus biological materials into the consumer and the user, and starts looking at how the circularity revolves around this. And it's great if you understand it and you can look at those different components, but really after every time I look at these different diagrams, it's more like a picture of my brain after 3 espressos and probably about 14 beers. So it becomes complicated, but we need to look at the elements of that and unpack that. And in terms of doing that, we really need to understand this evolution. So a linear economy is really in terms of how we look at the extraction of resources, how those then go into a production system, those then go into the consumers, and then ultimately what happens is waste comes out. This is the linear economy. So what we start looking at in terms of this evolution is creating this chain economy, where production, consumption, and downcycling start becoming part of that process. Circular economy starts looking at secondary loops within that. So now we're looking at sustainable production, sustainable consumption, and upcycling, with internal loops within there. So we're taking it from waste to resources, connecting the dots, and converting the loops into circles. The problem we have in South Africa in terms of a circular economy is geometry. In South Africa, we work in boxes and silos. We work in boxes and silos. So it's the old adage of trying to hammer a square peg into a round hole. We need to transgress and engage these boxes and silos to understand the geometric issue of evolving our economy into a circular economy. So the way I unpack that is I take the circular components and I put them into boxes. That's what people understand. So let's try and create those boxes. And in the circular economy, I talk about issues around life cycle assessment, balance of trade, CSR or corporate social responsibility, socioeconomic upliftment, green procurement, supply chain management, resource efficiencies, and impact mapping. So we take a lot of that complexity and we break it down into different components, and let's go into some of those in a bit of detail. So life cycle assessment is really about understanding and assessing the costs of not having to landfill a waste. So if you look at the landfill airspace and avoidance costs, the reality is that, you know, if we look at the prices that we charge at our landfill sites are not reflective of the true costs of landfill in any way. So when you look at everything from actual collection, picking it up, whether it's during a beach cleanup or conventional waste management collection, you look at the transport costs, and then you look at the cost of an engineered landfill site, and then the management of that site, and the cover material and what's required, and the staffing, and all the other different requirements. If we can avoid that cost, what is the benefit there? How do we valorize the cost benefit of not having to extract virgin materials in terms of material costs as well as the energy and water wastage? So from a life cycle analysis perspective, all of the upstream and downstream costs. So if you are comparing the cost of a concrete paving stone versus a recycled glass plastic paving stone, how do you valorize the cost of not having done it the original way? And that's a complicated step to go through, but we need to do it as a city, as a region, as a country. We then also need to look at the opportunities this provides in terms of job creation. And this is the big buzzword. Everybody is talking about jobs, and that's what it needs to be driven around. And we need to understand the cost savings on recycled materials, so versus the virgin material, and how this can potentially reduce imports. Now, imports, for example, glass is a prime example. At one stage, South Africa was importing thousands of tons of sandblasting grit material from China at R8.50 a kilogram, and yet we're throwing away our own glass for no value. So it's just, we've got to look at these things in reality. And that also reduces imports across many different value chains. So a life cycle assessment is an important component to understanding that circular economy and looking at the real true costs of that conversion. So you can't look at product A versus product B and say, well, this one is R5 for product A and product B is R5.50. But if you look at the life cycle analysis of that product, if one is a unsustainable product versus the other one, which is creating jobs, taking waste out of the environment, saving landfill, helping the environment, et cetera, we need to look at those costs in true reality. The second is balance of trade. So we currently import more materials than we manufacture locally. Prime example, I was chatting on another one of my circular economy TV shows where we spoke about the fact that South Africa mines 67 million tons of iron ore every year, but we export 58 million tons of it. We only have a 7 million ton production capacity in South Africa, so we are a net importer of more than double that into the country. We've got to stop that. It just does not make sense whatsoever. And we have the opportunities because we have the raw materials, and there's some great work that's being done by the likes of Sasol and DSI, looking at the development of a hydrogen economy that's going to create green steel. We need to embrace that. But imports and exports are a large portion of our GDP. And if you look at from 2010 to 2018, we had basically an 85 billion rand deficit in terms of our balance of trade, which means that there was a lot more money going out of the country than coming in. We are fortunate at the moment. This has changed slightly, and largely not because of any of our own doing. So if you look at the commodities drive with regards to gold, coal, iron, etc., the pricing structure and how that has increased with regards to global events such as the Ukraine-Russia war, Those are elements that have changed that dynamic, but again, we're going to come back into a deficit because we simply are not manufacturing. Manufacturing used to be 23% of our GDP, it's now 9% of our GDP. Where's all that manufacturing gone? So when we look at that understanding, just in terms of waste, for example, so this is some of the stuff that's been done by the Department of Science and Innovation on their RDI waste roadmap, where you start to look at all of the different components in terms of waste management, environmental benefit, economics, and socioeconomic benefit. And the numbers are astounding. If we look at the potential resource value, is around about 17.4 billion rand of materials that we throw into landfills. The avoided cost of avoiding that would be nearly 5 billion rand per year. And then additional externalities of landfilling, about another 5 billion per year. So when we look at these avoided financial costs and externalities associated with virgin material production, we need to understand that opportunity that we are missing in this country. And that is an enormous opportunity that we need to look at. And corporate social responsibility is a key application around that. And this includes extended producer responsibility. So EPR, we've kind of migrated from our Section 28 government initiated EPR system to now a Section 18 industry-led EPR. And it's taken a long time to get there. And I think we still have a long way to go. But it's not the be all and end all. And I don't think it is addressing all of the different issues. But there's opportunities in terms of creating a more meaningful EPR, but also aligning corporate social responsibility with that. And that would help to achieve the goals of a positive waste economy. And part of that really is looking at this whole issue around supplier development, enterprise development, and skills development. These are good for the economy. There's a big issue in terms of saying Black economic empowerment has not worked in this country. And I'm one of the people who will absolutely say it has not worked. It has benefited the few. It has not benefited the masses. But it's not all about ownership. So a lot of foreign companies are always worried about the ownership issue, where 51% has got to go into black hands, or 26% as a voting share. And there's a lot of concern about that. But that's not what the BEE options look for. So if we look at this and drive into that legislation, there is a lot of good work that's been done, and it's just been badly put out there. When we look at the opportunity around transformation through enterprise development, skills development, supplier development, there are massive, massive, massive opportunities from a circular economy perspective that we can unpack there. That would benefit government, would benefit the private sector, and benefit the people. So we need to look at making sure that this is done properly. And that also brings us to socioeconomic upliftment. So how do we create a secondary resources economy with all of those resources that we're throwing away? And it's right across the value chain. Here we mentioned some of the numbers. So municipal solid waste is around about 26 million tons of waste. If you look at fly ash, which is a byproduct of our coal-fired power stations, there's another 36 million tons a year. If you look at our steel sector, there's about another 2 million tons that comes out of that. In our agricultural sector, there's something like 44 million metric tons of agricultural residues that are either burnt in the field or not utilized. We need to understand all of these different waste streams. How do we look at those in terms of creating a secondary resources economy, offsetting current unsustainable models that are essentially just widening the gap between the haves and the have-nots? We need to embrace enterprise development. We need to embrace that specifically through the development of creating sustainable jobs, looking at our supply chains. We need to reduce operational costs and enhance competitiveness. And the circular economy brings that in oodles to create that transition. And when we understand that you look at the multiplier effect, if you're creating something out of nothing, the multiplier effect is enormous. So not only do you get direct jobs, you also get indirect jobs. So a direct job would be somebody driving a glass processing system. Indirect jobs would be security and cleaning. Induced jobs are secondary components that come out of that. So you've then got the opportunities sort of downstream, and that is going to incorporate your pickers, your informal sector, and other applications and support services around that industry. And then you get inferred jobs. So inferred jobs now means you have more people involved or active in the economy, and those people need to buy clothes, they need to buy food, they need to pay school fees, they need to buy a car, they need to go to the cinema, and that creates further jobs because now you're creating more money in the pockets of the people. So you're looking at 3 to 4 times greater impact through creating these types of jobs than you are through conventional commercial type systems. And then green procurement has got to be the driver behind everything. If you look at the benefits of green procurement, for example, reducing hazardous substances, reducing carbon emissions, carbon is a vitally important component of where we are as a country at the moment. You may know the government has implemented a carbon tax, but the carbon tax is really there as a stick. It's not there as a carrot. So as soon as you talk about a tax, it always gets people a bit sweaty. But when you understand where we are as a country in terms of our signatory obligations to the United Nations Climate Change Program, UNFCCC, to the Paris Climate Agreement, and also understanding the global responses which South Africa have signed in terms of the international financial trade regulations, and how that is going to report back to ESG reporting and sustainability around the carbon structure, there are such big opportunities around that. How do we improve the competitiveness of eco-industries and preserve natural resources, as well as promoting the uptake of green products and looking at bringing that cash into the economy? So that is a purpose of promoting a secondary resources economy. We shouldn't be importing. We're a net importer, for example, of cement. I mean, why? We use about 20 million tons of cement in this country every year, and yet we import 7 million tons of that. And yet we have the resources here. We need to drive those market developments through legislation and policy. It needs to be based on local procurement, sustainable procurement, cost competitiveness, and low carbon transition economies. And then incentivize these recycling options. So there needs to be a level of support in terms of creating a baseline. And that's going to be essential to creating a stable economy. But it also allows us to look at better managed resources and improved efficiency, as well as creating a greater business ethic where businesses start acting more responsibly, and consumers who are voting with the wallet are driving that demand. And supply chain management is critical to all of that. Unfortunately, this is one of the biggest issues we have with regards to corruption and fraud and mismanagement in this country. But the opportunity to change this around gives us that outlet through particularly inclusive and transformative economic development. So, when you look at a lot of the political stuff that's happening in terms of RET profiles and the different applications, we are not embracing the opportunity that we have in the youth, the skills, the resources, and the own market that we have here, to embrace that in creating an inclusive and transformative economic development. And that's the way we need to drive it forward. We need to develop local skills and entrepreneurial development. We need to stop focusing on tertiary education as the be all and end all. Not everybody needs a degree. We need people with the skills, the hands-on skills in agriculture, in engineering, in electrics, in welding. We need to go back to skills that are going to create real jobs, and look at reducing negative social, environmental, and economic impacts. And that's the big benefit of a circular economy transition. And this can be done through promoting the use of recycled materials, through particular material specification and bylaws. And this can reduce costs and increase efficiencies. So take one example of that. So for example, construction builders waste is a huge component of our annual municipal solid waste. So our MSW is, as I said, around about 26 million tons, which means that about 7.2 million tons of that is construction demolition waste. That's a large chunk of that waste stream that's going into a hole in the ground. If we changed the supply chain material specifications and bylaws that every new road built in this country had to have at least 30% recycled aggregate as a sub-base, you would create a market that wouldn't cost the government a cent. It would create thousands of jobs and drive that product into the system, and everybody benefits. And you would take away 30% of our waste problem. These are very simple things that can be done, but it's going to be driven through material specifications and laws, regulations. So those are the opportunities that we have through supply chain management, where we can drive a circular economy. But then we also need to understand that with regards to resource efficiencies. How do we use less and live better? Promote the management and efficient use of resources and materials, promoting innovation and local development, and saving natural resources. That in turn benefits biodiversity. It lowers energy and water usage and improves the economics and balance of trade. So let me give you another example there. So if you look at, for example, sand mining in the KwaZulu-Natal environment, we have probably 90% of the sand extraction is done illegally by uncertified and unregistered companies that extracts sand out of our rivers, which impacts on water quality, on water flow, on biodiversity and ecology. And then the downstream issues of that is that we're not producing enough sand coming down our rivers to replenish the sand on our beaches, which means that Durban now spends 30 to 40 million rand a year pumping sand back onto the beaches after spring tides for our tourism industry. And yet we are throwing away thousands of tons of glass and inert wastes which can replace sand. And glass, for example, as a replacement to water filtration sand, is a far superior product that lasts 10 times longer with multiple other benefits. So when you look at all those different efficiencies and how that works, I can unpack it for you with any single waste stream, and I can give you numbers, I can give you opportunities and potential job creation. Glass alone, if we did that properly in this country, would be able to create 80,000 jobs across this country. It's as simple as that. So we need to then unpack it in terms of what are the impacts and the outcomes. We need to look at the why, the who, the how, and the what. And that really is an issue. You know, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So we need to understand from an impact perspective, what is the impact of reduced resources uses and related impacts? What are the impacts with regards to carbon savings and remediation? If you look at climate change, our recent floods in KZN are a prime example. The drought that you're facing in the NMB area is a prime example of climate change. And if you start looking at putting costs to that, you know, that starts to change the dynamic somewhat. Even the simple cost savings of avoiding landfill and transport. Look at the opportunities and the impact in terms of job creation. So it's not just that we need jobs, but that also reduces the burden on the state in terms of grants and subsidies. It creates more skills. It reduces impacts and negative impacts in terms of biodiversity and climate change, and improves water quality and management. And water is a massive issue in this country. We are a water scarce country, and yet we are not looking at the opportunities around that. If you look at the operation of our wastewater treatment works across the country, we're in a dismal state. We are pumping billions of liters of untreated or semi-treated sewage into our sea daily. It's an absolute environmental nightmare. And yet there are opportunities where we can use that material to convert that into hydrogen as an energy application. We can use it to convert it into organic fertilizers, and then we can separate that water as a clean resource that can be reutilized in industrial and even drinking water applications. All of these need to be unpacked in terms of understanding that situation. But the reality is that we need to decouple two critical issues. And if you look at the municipal issue, the municipalities make a lot of money out of reselling electricity and reselling water. So it's not in a municipality's best interests to allow people to generate their own electricity or secure their own water. So we've got to decouple that from an economic perspective also to start driving the opportunity for upliftment and transformation, so that you put the power back into the hands of the people rather than having the few demanding the rights of the many. So upliftment and transformation is a critical component to that. And as I said, how do we align this with the Sustainable Development Goals? Circular economy is the only way we are going to achieve this. So when you look at the SDGs, poverty, hunger, health, education, equality, sanitation, etc., we have 15 out of the 17. We can work on gender equality, but it's very difficult to create a direct link there. And peace and justice, I can create the link, but it's not direct. So yeah, essentially we can create all the SDGs, but I claim 15 of the 17 SDGs that we can develop through the transition to a circular economy. So the reality is that sustainable solutions and smart opportunities in circular economy are not only possible, they're economically viable. We need to wake up. We need to look at how we attach those opportunities, and we need to see how we bring that all together. That is going to give us all a sustainable future going forward. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Chris, for your presentation. You've touched on a lot of things in terms of the circular economy. Your insights that you've mentioned, the role of opportunities in resource-intensive sectors, as well as, as you have been mentioning, I began to remember some of the reports that I've been reading, and one of them comes from the CSIR, looking at different sectors and the role that those sectors are playing when it comes to the circular economy, not only circular economy when looking at, South Africa, but also, sub-Saharan African states, which are actually battling with fundamental sustainable development challenges, such as widespread poverty, hunger, food and nutrition, and as well as social services that you've mentioned, inclusive of education and healthcare. So while there are many intersecting reasons for such a crisis, today, Chris, you opened our eyes and allowed us to reflect on the role the circular economy can play as a solution. So we have a couple of comments, questions. I'll just read some of the comments and then go over to the questions and then give over to you, Chris, to respond. And then we do another round, as I say that we have enough time for such a powerful engagement. So we have a comment from Uluvuyo Bangazi saying, thank you, Chris. Please remember us on radio and help us visualize your slides. The other comment comes from Gubelanga saying the Minister of Transport also mentioned that the rural areas roads will be paved going forward. Maybe this is an opportunity. We also have a comment from Zoliswa Ngogoi saying we need to advocate for the circular economy more to the municipalities as they are waste management stakeholders in our society. This comment ties into the question that I have. So outside of resource-intensive sectors, moving to the role of the lower government, what is then your take, Chris, on the role of local government policy in the circular economy, looking at the social capital of circular cities and building socio-economic case for the circular economy? We have other questions. Let me just check quickly. Just one question and then give over for you, Chris, to respond. So we have a question from Wandile saying, I love this seminar. They always on spot on, saying what should be done, especially if it aligns with SDGs. But the issue is our government, because we cannot do anything without involving them. How do we enforce the government to take the necessary measures to ensure that projects as these are implemented and monitored. Well, Chris, I'll give over to you to respond while checking on other social media platforms if you have any other engagements.
Great, thank you very much. So if you look at some of those opportunities, I mean, the first one is that the statements, and also the President, Ramaphosa, also mentioned the same thing, is that how do we unlock opportunities in local communities to become suppliers into paving local roads? There are so many opportunities in terms of doing that. So the ocean paver type system is one. There's other project developments we've been looking at now with compressed earth block technology, using soil stabilized compressed earth, using local resources with distributed technology that could create thousands of jobs. These are all systems that we need to drive. The issue is the procurement. So what a politician says and what they do are two very different things. It needs to drill down in terms of those key issues that I mentioned: material specification and green procurement. So that's key elements around the supply chain, where if government is really driven around this thing, we need to unpack several different components, and it's complicated. And I'll tell you why it's complicated. Because first of all, one needs to ensure quality control. So around different product developments, there are a number of complexities with regards to certification, compliance, and engineering specifications. So there are so many poor quality concrete products out there that, you know, every standard is based around the concrete standard, and concrete is the big bad bear in terms of carbon. I mean, it contributes to 8% of all carbon emissions globally, just cement. Yet as soon as you try and use a different product, you get the book thrown at you because it doesn't fit into our SABS standards. So we need new standards that comply for recycled resource materials or sustainable materials. That then needs to be approved by the engineers in terms of its structural integrity with regards to compressive strength, modulus of flexibility, etc. So there's a process to go through. So often what happens is the government will go out there and they'll shout something out, and then nothing happens. Prime example of that is the Presidential Infrastructure Coordinating Committee, which in 2015 stipulated that 60% of all social infrastructure would be built with alternative building materials by 2020. They basically managed to achieve less than 0.3% of that, not 60%. So what we do is we just change the goalposts and we said, okay, let's see what we can do by 2040. There's no accountability. So we need to drive that accountability and transparency in terms of developing these things. So there's a lot of opportunities around that. But as you're aware, there's a lot of problems. So we have the solutions, we have the opportunities, and I think to try and generate it from a nationwide perspective is going to be very difficult. What we want to do is we want to focus on case studies. Let's look at a road, a route, or something from Port Elizabeth to East London. Say, right, we're going to look at plastic roads, we're going to look at recycled infrastructure, recycled sub-base, and put it on the ground and show everybody that it works. Then look at the next one. That's how we're going to do it. When we try and look at solving the problem at the top level, it never happens. So it never happens on the ground. So we need to become more action-oriented. The next question, in terms of advocating for circular economy, in terms of waste management and local government, we have a big issue. And again, it's because of the structure of waste management. Waste management, depending on the municipality, will either be under social services, or it will be under infrastructure, or it will be its own group under waste management. And this is putting it into that box and that silo that I mentioned to you before. Waste should not be in a box. Waste should be viewed from, if I had my way, it should be under economic development. Not any other organization in government, under economic development, where we look at not the problem, but we look at the opportunities and how we unpack those opportunities. And that's where government needs to change its narrative as well. We need to stop talking about waste. We need to start talking about resources and how those resources can be unpacked in transforming economies and skills development in local communities to become integrated into that process where everybody benefits, whether it's from infrastructure or from manufacturing or whatever the outcomes and impacts would be. The circular economy provides that opportunity. But when we package waste into a subdivision of local government, it just becomes a problem. And we always see waste management as a problem, not as an opportunity. And that's where we need to change that. At national government level, there are fantastic systems and technologies we just cannot put on the ground here because either our legislation is 40 years out of date or it's just not implemented properly in terms of understanding the economic benefits that new technologies can bring us. So we need to look at the national as well as the local government. But the first step that they can do in terms of promoting and creating the opportunity is to look at those key issues: material specification, procurement, and supply chain. And then how do we enforce government to drive circular economy? I think what we need to understand is that there's a lot of really good work that's going on at government level, fantastic work, and I work with most of them. So the work that's being done by the Department of Science and Innovation is groundbreaking stuff. You know, if you look at not just the waste side, working with the informal sector, but the understanding of the different circular economy perspectives, the engagement around new technologies and driving a hydrogen economy. These are all critical issues that we need to look at with regards to understanding how we unpack this. And there are many organizations. So the National Cleaner Production Center, the NBI, National Business Initiative, even National Treasury has got a whole bunch of things that are going on. CSR is doing some fantastic work. The problem is they're not talking to each other. And we're not getting to the level of implementation. We're talking more about strategy, systems, but we're not doing. Sorry, I just muted that person. I don't know who they were. So we need to look at understanding that there are many components to this, and this silo mentality that we deal with in government is not helping. What we almost need is we need a new minister or a new government, a new department that has an overarching role to understand multi-sectoral approaches of circular economy and how it's going to transition the African economy, to work across those different silos to break down those barriers. So we've got a long road ahead, and we need to stop talking about it and we need to start doing it. So one of my key focus areas is project development. You can talk the hind legs off a donkey and I can do 20 different consulting contracts, but you put a project on the ground and you show people it working. That's the way you do it. Stop talking, we talk about the academics getting involved now in circular economy and now you can get degrees in circular economy. Forget it. Let's start working on actual ground applications in all those different sectors, show that they work. Then we look at the additionality. How do we now cookie cutter that into the next application, So we need to move out of the talk shops and we need to move into making it happen.
Thank you so much, Chris, for responding to those questions. Colleagues, as we have heard, circular economy could provide more and more real opportunities, not only to strengthen the national or the global SDGs, but also local manufacturing, waste management, reduce dependence on resource imports, unlock new economic opportunities, improve sustainability of other investment areas, create jobs, and position South Africa, especially in the short term as we are recovering post-COVID-19 green economy. I agree with you, Chris, when you're mentioning that, there is indeed a lot of work going on. And I mean, one has to remind themselves that we need to know how transformation works and how transformation is an ongoing process in itself, and acknowledge the work that is being done. But also a huge part of it looks into, as I echo your reflections, is how do we then enforce stakeholder relationships and start working together in this ongoing circular economic transformation? I see there's some questions on the chats again, but just so to continue the conversation, you know, one of the questions that I had as well is based on whether there is a redress pillar to the discussion of a circular economy. What do I mean by redress? I mean the improvement of food security through regenerative agriculture is a key discussion in circular economy, and how that may look like in many countries where such resources belong to a selected few, while they are also exported to other capitalist states for manufacturing. Is there a redress now in terms of that discussion when it comes to circular economy? But going back to the discussions, there's quite a lot of stamina in the chats in terms of the conversation. Zolisa is saying, I agree with you, we can achieve more SDGs through the circular economy. Thanks. And Andrew Barton saying, waste is only waste if we waste it. That is a quotation from William. So from your own circular economy subsidiary, is it very gratifying to see the real work being done by multinational or corporates to pursue zero waste to landfill pursuits? Success depends on it, all being financial viable, of course. Read the new products developed. And then Tandutolo Ngubelanga is saying NMBM is currently partnering with VWSA, Triple BEE Trust, and on the 12 projects identified is waste. How I wish this knowledge can be imported on the work the city will be doing with VWSA. I think I can just hand over to you. Okay, there's a question from Lutando Nomzaza, and I think you've touched on it, but just to mention it. So what is the government doing to expedite this? What is the Department of Environmental Affairs saying about this journey? Is it the old problem of lack of political will to implement things? In a country faced with huge youth unemployment numbers, the number of jobs that can be created through these alternatives is needed as soon as possible. I think, Chris, I'll now give over to you to respond, and then check colleagues for hands for those who would like, to verbalize their comments or questions. Over to you, Chris.
Sure, thank you. So I've just written down a little summary of the questions, and I'm hoping that I can get there. The food security issue for me is absolutely, it's so close to my heart. And I'm doing a lot of work globally. I'm working in Rwanda at the moment with the IKEA Foundation, others looking at food security issues, and yet we're not addressing them here. And food security, the problem, as I mentioned before, is that we've forgotten what that's about. And unfortunately, that is an outcome and an impact in terms of our social grant system, because it's easy enough to think about waiting to the end of the month and getting your social grant so that you can go and buy your groceries, than actually going out there and working for it. And this is where one of my saddest things is the lack of township economies. So when I travel across Africa, I can mention any country from Nigeria, Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, DRC. When you go through those townships, there is every second household has got something going on. They're manufacturing something out of wood, or they're fixing tires, or they're growing vegetables, or they are cooking soup, or they're doing whatever. You don't see that anymore. In South Africa, you can go through townships, and even in terms of people growing their own vegetables, you hardly see that anymore. You can't go past a single house in Zambia that's not growing its own food, because they don't have a social system. They don't have a fallback. So unfortunately, the social system has reduced our own dependency to be self-sufficient. And on top of that, we have a secondary problem, is that we have, and this really came out with the riots from last year, is the haves versus the have-nots. The sectors have been dominated by the big corporates. So if you now look at food, everyone goes to Checkers, Woolworths, Spar, the big shops in the big centers because they have the buying power to create the cheaper prices, and they control everything. They control everything from what the farmer's growing to the pricing that they're putting food on your table for. We've forgotten the corner shops. We've forgotten the local sustainability. We've forgotten the barter system. We've forgotten the Ubuntu system, where our neighbors who are battling can have some of our spinach. It just doesn't happen anymore. And that's, I think, for me, the sad reflection of where we are as a country is that we need to go back into understanding not only food security, but food sovereignty. Food security, you can grow vegetables, but if you're held to account by one of the Monsanto seed companies, for example, where your global funds are worth billions, and yet we can't afford to buy the seeds. All of these are different issues. So sovereignty and security are two different components, but we need to look at those supply chains. If you look at the fresh food market in eThekwini as a prime example, less than 30% of the product that comes through that fresh food market comes from KZN. Okay, put that into your brains, because that now, if you think about where is it coming from, where is it going to be transported from? So in one of my slides, I showed there the fact that we all move to the cities for opportunities, and yet we leave the land whether we had the water and the food. So we need to start thinking about that again. And food security is going to be paramount behind this. I have a huge fear after the riots last year, is that at the moment we're looking at our government who's hardly able to pay its own staff salaries. What happens if they can't afford to pay the grants? I don't even want to think about that and the devastation that will have. So we need to become more self-sufficient. We cannot rely on government. And food security is a critical component to that. How do we look at communities, villages, becoming more self-sufficient, growing higher quality, better nutrition food locally, and instead of spending money with somebody else, they're using their own resources to create that food. So food security to me is a critical component that we need to look at. But we can drive it on both on a subsistence perspective, but also on an economic perspective. So when you look at some of the stuff that Ma Joy has been doing with Umgibe in terms of looking at developing systems around protein with eggs and chicken, looking at the food processing. So now, again, corporate social responsibility comes into that, because now we can go to a supply chain, like a restaurant chain, and we can say, listen, from an enterprise development, supplier development perspective, I can give you somebody who can supply you some of the best sources that you need. And it's all looking at local employment and local skills development and youth generation and all these sort of things, and it meets all the objectives. The opportunities are there, we're just not unpacking them. So we need to create those opportunities in terms of understanding that food security also with global changes. If you look at from COVID to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, how that has impacted global supply chains, we need to become more self-sufficient, and that's really a critical issue. So the international drive on zero waste, again, we're seeing that everywhere, and I think that the opportunities we need to look at, and again, I'm going to unpack that into agriculture. So one of the prime examples, we're looking at the zero waste, but we're also looking at carbon neutrality. So COP26, Conference of the Parties, number 26 in Glasgow, that happened recently. South Africa gained 8.3 billion euros in terms of looking at decarbonizing our energy sector. There are such massive opportunities there. If we look at just the underutilized agricultural land that we have in this country, on last estimate, just looking at KZN and Mpumalanga, we were looking at about 2 million hectares of land. Now, put that into perspective. 2 million hectares is the size of Mauritius. We have that in agricultural land that's sitting bare. But we're not going back into agriculture. The opportunity is that we can grow energy crops. We can grow, so again, not competing with food in any way, but we can grow sorghum, we can grow paulownia, we can grow bamboo, and we can convert that into a torrefied or a dark pellet that will replace coal with zero emissions, and we're putting carbon back into the soil, and you'll create hundreds of thousands of jobs in the agricultural sector on land that is now just been abandoned. So these are simple opportunities where we need to look at that. But that drive around zero waste is based on that procurement. And even if we look at being realistic, Europe doing a fantastic job. If you look at Germany, zero to landfill, okay, already, they've achieved it. But they've only achieved that because 35% of it still needs to go to incineration because there is no solution for it. But we need to look at multiple technologies that drive these sector developments. And that's when I talk about energy in Africa. So energy, if we look at energy in Africa, every little tiny village has the resources it needs to become self-sufficient in energy. And whether, yes, let's look at solar, let's look at wind. Those are key issues. But then what are the resources they have there in terms of agricultural residues, plastic waste, and look at those opportunities in a way that is going to create a system that is not going to drive the big issue we have in Africa, which is the decimation of our forests for charcoal, because charcoal is our biggest energy component in the continent. So we need to drive that and understanding the realities of the international drive on circular economy and zero waste versus Africa. And that's where we've got to change our dynamic. We are still trying to push a Eurocentric version of waste management onto our people. So some people pay rates and they put the money into the waste management side of things. Other people don't, which means we spread those resources over a greater population. But we now try a landfill operation with compaction trucks. And yet we're not actually tapping into those resources to look at the applications. Durban's a prime example. Since I've started there, 750 tons a day of green waste is separated in garden refuse sites and blue bag systems, but then thrown into the same landfill site. That could go into energy, it could go into bioorganic fertilizer, it could go into ethanol production, it can go into biodiesel production, it can go into all these different things. And we haven't done it because we're following the hump and dump mentality, and we need to change that. The last one was the lack of political will. I don't think there's a lack of political will. And if you look at the President's office, through the Presidential Climate Change Committee, if you look at the work that's being done by DFFE through Operation Pakisa, they definitely know what to do. First, there's a lack of money, but in changing, you've got to change the system. So we know some of the work we're doing with environmental affairs, for example, is that we can show them how things will cost them nothing if they change policy in terms of procurement and material specification. The example of the construction demolition waste is a key one. If you create that market, people will invest into a crushing sieving system because they know they have a market that's going to buy their product. Done. Doesn't cost the taxpayer, doesn't cost government a cent. Those are very simple applications to make that happen. But what we're not seeing is we're not seeing that policy change. And we need to see that policy change in terms of converting political will into political action. And unfortunately, our government does a lot of fantastic strategic documents and but implementation, we need implementation. And let's not try and fix the whole elephant. Let's fix the elephant's toenail. And then we can fix the elephant's leg, and then we can fix the rest of the elephant. But if we don't start getting into action and leave the policies and things until we can fix it as we go along by showing what can be done, that's where we need to get there. I hope I answered those 3 questions.
Yes, yes, Chris, thank you very much. How I wish this conversation could extend to more other stakeholders, especially those that come from disadvantaged communities, as a form of public knowledge access, as I believe the work of a circular economy also largely needs to include the co-creation of partnerships with rural development. Well, this is a start to such community engagement conversations. Colleagues, do we have any hands? I see we have a comment from the chats coming from Zoliswa saying, I think we should all start to commit in our own spaces, yes, in order to contribute in eliminating the current faced challenges, more especially the climate change. In achieving the SDGs, we can have a great impact when we implement them in our organizations from the areas where we can apply, when we can apply them. The other one comes from Chandipolo saying, Chris needs to put a proposal together and some recommendations that will assist government moving forward. That's my view, and I agree, Chandipolo. Just going once, colleagues, just to see if we have any other hands. There is a hand from African Rise, and there's also another hand from Mandla Maseko. Colleagues, I think this is sort of like a last round of questions. So you can post your comments and questions or raise your hand so that you can verbalize your comments or questions. After that, I think, Chris, you've been speaking for almost 2 hours now. So you can just respond to the questions and then offer your closing reflections. But just before then, let us take the hands and then you can respond to it all and then offer us with your closing reflections. We'll start with African Rise, followed by Mandla, and then Sia Mandla. Over to you, African Rise. I can't seem to hear anything from my side. Can you hear? Okay, we'll come back to you, African Rise. Please try to log out and log in again to see if your mic will be working. If that fails, we will wait for your comment on the chats. Let's go to Mandla.
And starting to play in the second half. That was a falling from Liverpool. It's why maybe it's the reason why maybe Villarreal was so good. But I think credit to Villarreal players. They gave what they had to give.
Sorry, colleagues, I am muting.
Second half
Okay.
because of the physical aspect of the game, where maybe they gave too much.
Say if it was the analysis paper.
There is an audio. I keep muting the person, but they keep unmuting themselves. Please, colleagues, make sure that you stay muted, not unless you have your hand up and you've been given a chance to voice your comment or question. Let's go, Sia. Hi, Sia Mandla.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, thanks.
Okay, great stuff. Thanks, Asif. I've actually been struggling to log on myself, but I've been listening on Facebook Live. And Chris, thank you very much for a very constructive presentation. I think I'm just going to speak from a manufacturer's point of view. I currently run a manufacturing company called Rhino Manufacturing. So predominantly we produce plastic products, right, for the construction sector, agricultural sector, and the packaging sector. So predominantly our products are made out of recycled plastic waste. We produce probably 10 tons of production on a daily basis, which is quite a lot of plastic. So I totally agree. I think I just want to give advocacy to what you just said, that and it is my also personal conviction that there is economic value when it comes to waste, because from where I'm sitting, we're able to repurpose what is supposed to be plastic that should be going to landfill, and we understand what happens to plastic because it doesn't disappear when you put it on landfill, and it's got all sorts of consequences thereafter. So if you look at the product range that we make, it supports construction industries, it supports the agricultural issue. I've heard you also mention the issue of food security. I mean, we produce out of that waste plastics irrigation pipes that is used by farmers to make sure that they transport water to tons and tons of hectares of land, where of course it's got to do with food security. So I totally agree, and I think I just want to zoom my comment because I'm also an advocate of the township economy space, and I think it has been my biggest issue now that you know, everywhere we go, the plastic seems to be the biggest waste stream, and it's actually quite visible. It might not be the biggest in terms of tonnage. I think you've also alluded to that, but it is the most visible waste stream out there. So it is quite an issue. And I don't know what your comment would be, Chris, especially in terms of your understanding of the township space as well. My biggest issue is that we're not able to address it because there is no proper waste management infrastructure in the township. So what you see at the current in the current form is that the municipalities are able to come once a week to collect waste, but it's not adequate, to actually manage the waste that is being produced in the township. And there is so many contributing factors to that, because I know I was talking to a colleague of mine. I said one of the biggest issues that you've got waste that is coming from, of course, household, but you also have commercial waste that comes from the small outlets, whether it's these tuck shops, and they don't have a waste management plan, as compared to, for instance, if you were to look at a mall in the township, that they would have a waste merchant that would come through and collect that waste, and to either go to the landfill, or it will be commercialized. But if you look at the role players, the small guys that are running supermarkets or tuck shops or spaza shops, there is no waste management plan for that. So what they do, they would hire this these guys to go and dump the waste. So that's what it does. It promotes waste dumping, and it's the biggest challenge that we've got. So my assertion is that I know it's easy to accuse people, to say that they don't they dump first, and secondly is that there's no pride in the areas that they live. But if they do not have a space where they can actually dump legally, and then we can talk about all sorts of other things thereafter, because once we create that that waste management infrastructure in the township, then we are able to go to the second layer of it. How then do we commercialize that waste? Because at the moment, people don't understand. For instance, I always keep telling them that you're throwing plastic, and this plastic has got value. We buy this plastic on a day-to-day basis. But the problem is that the awareness is not there. The people are not aware. So how do we resolve that? How do we make sure that we educate people, but we also create the proper infrastructure that is going to encourage a proper disposition of that waste, and obviously create the secondary jobs, because that's what waste economy also does. It creates the jobs that we've already alluded to. So yeah, that's basically my comment, and I think that's something quite topical at the moment, and it's something that I'm advocating for, that there has to be some sort of a proper waste management plan for townships. I mean, I know that there was not even a township economy policy up until recent. So there is a lot of waste that gets generated in that space, and it's not commercialized. There's no value for it. It's not assisting in creating the much needed jobs that we're all crying for now at the moment.
Thank you so much, Sia. Just before we move on to Mandla Maseko, I see you back, and then we take it back to Chris to respond to the questions, and then just offer, closing remarks so that you can move to the last item of vote of thanks. The MBDA group, especially Asanda, who's the events coordinator, has sent me a message saying that could you please ask those interested to be included to future webinars to please leave their email addresses by the chat box, because the conversation here is fire and there's more stamina and more angles to it. In fact, more other topics that you can have in this conversation series. So if you are interested to be part of the MBDA conversation webinars, please leave your email address on the chats. Mandla Maseko will finish off the Q&A with you and then take it back to Chris. Over to you, Mandla.
Thank you, Program Director. My apologies, I did not unmute the previous time. Thanks to the presenter. My name is Mandla Kelvin Maseko. I thank Singa for inviting us to the meeting. I just want to comment on or maybe ask a question on the comment that one of the colleagues raised about lack of funding. Because I'm thinking, is it lack of funding or is something else? Because surely we should be given some feedback one way or the other. on how much has the government generated on the green fund, the radioactive waste fund, whatever similar funds, because as far as I know, if you buy car tires, a certain portion of each tire goes to that green fund, because somewhere the tire must be like what Doc is saying, it must be recycled or upcycled, whatever you call it. And so is all these other, I mean, the policy of government says polluter, payer kind of, the polluter must pay. But now we should also be told how much money is sitting there. Listening to what Dr. Whyte is saying, how much, given the bureaucracy, unable, the idea is not able to be implemented because government is saying you can't go that as per what he's saying in terms of SABS. Therefore, we should be told that maybe since we cannot implement this project, so much money has been sitting there, not being implemented. But if you think this way, then that money can be utilized. And I don't see any marketing about, I mean, look at, for example, we are now buying plastic. We grow up not buying plastic when you go and shop our groceries. But when we're told that now we're going to introduce the buying of plastic, we're told that part of the money of plastic will also go to projects that Dr. Whyte is talking about, so that at least we recycle or upcycle, whatever. But I'm not getting any feedback on whether how much has been generated on that. Thank you.
Some great points there. So yeah, obviously two very passionate individuals. So yeah, manufacturing. I feel your pain. I know how difficult it is. I mean, the reality is that what you're doing is a key part of the circular economy. So as you say, you're producing an agricultural piping that goes into the market that can help regenerative agriculture, etc. The issue again becomes the waste management in townships. And let me go back to your problem first. And I think I've felt your pain, because the problem is that often if you're looking at a recycled material, getting that recycled material into the conventional market is difficult, because you can only get an SABS approval if it's done with a virgin material. So that's first problem, which then means that you're now competing with imported products that are allowed to get an SABS stamp, as opposed to using a local product which is more sustainable. So I have a lot of pain from people in the manufacturing sector on that side of things, on certification and compliance around the products. The township economy component, to me, is for me simple, absolutely simple. And that's often when I spoke earlier about when I go into communities and I give presentations, that these youngsters look at you as if you're going to come and give them a lecture, and they just couldn't be bothered. They'd rather look at their cell phones. But when you start to open their eyes and they start to see those opportunities, and we can show them some of the stuff we've done with young township entrepreneurs who have now been trained into furniture manufacturing, using the resources around them with less than R1,000 investment. That's the way you start to change mindsets, by showing the real applications on the ground. But the waste management townships is based on two different issues. One is, mostly if you look at your townships, you are not at that socioeconomic level where the tax base is coming from there. So rates and taxes are not coming from there, which means that the municipalities who are servicing them are now having to take from the haves to give to the have-nots. And what happens is that we then spread out the resources too thin. I understand it's an issue. What we need to do is we need to create technological applications in those townships where every piece of waste becomes valuable. We have every solution, every technology available for that. Whether you're talking about nappies or contaminated plastics in the rivers, or glass or rubble or whatever, food waste, we need to unpack those opportunities in terms of addressing the issues. So, for example, agriculture, regenerative agriculture in those township areas. You know, if you had people growing with the local supply chain, they would take on a lot of that green waste and that food waste and use that as their resource into the next phase. I mean, it's a very simple thing to do. There's black soldier fly applications which can now be used to create protein, which feeds the chickens, which now becomes a viable business opportunity. But we've got to create the opportunity where every single person sees a piece of waste not as waste, but they see it as a value. And that's where something like we were looking at, for example, with the small-scale pyrolysis. We know we can probably create 117,000 jobs across this country by distributing mobile pyrolysis units. And each of those units would be put into a township area where you pay everybody R2 a kilogram for every piece of plastic they pick up. If you do that in the townships, there will be no plastic. They will pick it up because at the moment we have a cherry picking opportunity where they're now looking at maybe PET, but then they're going to hang on to 5 or 6 bulk bags of PET to get enough volume before it's worthwhile anybody coming there to pick it up from them. So there's issues from a cash flow perspective with the cherry picking thing. You need to create a value around every single component of the waste. And we can do that by unlocking the technology applications. And you know, the reality is that when we talk about waste to energy, everyone thinks of these massive big systems like I've seen in London and Germany, where you've got 150, 100, 200 million euro waste to energy plant that's processing 2,000-3,000 tons a day of waste. We're talking about systems as small as 50 kilowatt output. Locally designed, locally developed energy systems using local waste streams, which if you can't find it in the plastic or the tires, you grow it. These systems at 50 kilowatts, to put that into perspective, a 50 kilowatt power system would probably power 50 to 60 low to middle income homes. Okay, so you can generate power at that scale, at that small scale. And we have tried and tested proven systems here, but we need to allow it to happen. And that's where policy and regulation comes into a problem. The pyrolysis side of things, without going through the complications of refining and all the rest of it, you can simply put in systems that will convert plastic into a fuel oil. Again, making sure that you get your high value stuff, your polyprops and all the rest of it into the proper recycling sector. But we're looking more at the stuff we're not going to recycle it. So we don't want to disrupt the recycling chain. But each of those different applications where you can convert something, you're paying people to collect it. It goes to a central process. You're paying people to process it into a high value product. Now it's worthwhile sending a truck out to the middle of nowhere township to pick up 2 or 3 flow bins of pyro oil as opposed to 20 skips of empty plastic waste. So you create value chains, and that can be done with existing technology and opportunities. But you've got to drive that through procurement, because now if you had Eskom, who run what we call peak oil power stations, so normal transmission grid with coal is what we're all used to, but every city has a peak period. So they have peak oil power plants where they use diesel generators to increase the power supply in your peak periods. You can run that off of the fuel you produce from waste plastics. And that would create hundreds of thousands of jobs. It's that simple. Procurement, system development, authorization, legislation. So, township economy is a critical one. Mandla, there is no lack of funding. You're quite right. There's a lot of money out there. Unfortunately, most of it is misdirected. You mentioned 2 of them. One is the plastic bag levy, and the other one is the tire levy. Both of those were horribly mismanaged to the tune of billions of rands. And nobody's gone to jail, unfortunately. But now we're trying to pick up the tire situation. And again, we're looking at that same levy that's going to government. But at the moment, if we look at where we are as a country, we're probably collecting 5 to 6% of all of the waste tires that are emanating from consumers on an annual basis. It is not good enough. We need measurements. We need numbers. We need to know who's doing what. It needs to be removed from political alliances and it needs to go to commercial applications. And again, supply chains. If we look at we've got 2 or 3 really amazing technology providers in this country who produce the most amazing range of products from tire crumb. And if you went to Sanral and you said, right, every new bollard, balustrade, and everything else on our roads must be made from a recycled material, you would create a market for it that government would not have to put 1 cent into, because you would suddenly have the market drive to offset all these different products. It's not difficult, and yet we're largely importing steel bollards from China, which doesn't make sense. So we need to look at the issues, but also we need to understand the effectiveness and the efficacy of those funding applications, government should be standing trial. As far as I'm concerned, most of them involved in that should be put up against the wall and shot. In terms of the money that's been stolen from the people of this country and the opportunities that we have lost out on. So transparency and accountability are critical.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Chris, and also to the engagements that are coming in. I see a lot of people still have stamina, but due to time, perhaps I can just read, some of the comments and questions and see if Chris would like to respond, and then we officially close the Q&A. So we have Lutano saying, thanks for your answer on political will. You did say that the problem is the policy challenges and lack of money. I read somewhere that the government has a zero waste to landfill goal by 2030. Having mentioned the challenges, do you think we will be able to achieve this target, or it will just be what you call shifting of posts when this period arrives? And also we have a comment and question from African Rise. I'm saying, hi, thank you, Chris. This talk has been an absolute gem, I agree. Any information in terms of plastics collected, use thereof from Brakvel in Cape Town? What sort of economic numbers are we looking for? What is produced there? How do we change the mindset of less privileged South Africans who may feel working with waste is beneath them because it contradicts the life promised by politicians in the early 90s? Also ingrained in us that if we went to school, we would all work office jobs. Lastly, how do we encourage entrepreneurship versus seeking employment? Because I believe jobs will be less and less going forward. There's a comment also from Lutande again saying, how helpful has the Extended Producer Responsibility Act been? And do you think more regulation is needed or not? And I believe, Sia, that is a legacy hand. Yes, so thank you so much, colleagues, for that powerful engagement. I'll give over to Chris to just respond shortly.
All right, so for African Rise, I think I don't know the details around Brakvel, but I'm pretty sure that would be similar to a lot of the other systems that we're looking at. I mean, even if you look at the source separation programs that are being run by City of Cape Town, I mean, the byproduct or the bycatch in terms of non-recyclable plastics is still in the region of 30 to 40%. We've got to start looking at the value chains and all these different components. But yeah, the opportunity around what else do we need to ask the entrepreneurs? We have to start driving this. I mean, I'm constantly astounded. We're not a nation of stupid people, and yet everyone keeps going, government must create jobs. Government doesn't create jobs. Okay, we need to understand that, people. First off, and don't think government's going to create a job for you. I mean, any of the jobs that government's creating are not sustainable. You look at the YES program and all this sort of stuff. It's an opportunity for training. We need to move away from that mentality in terms of that education is a right and that we should all have an office job. We need to look at the farming side. We need to look at the hands-on side, plumbers, electricians. If you look at the recycling sector, and I'll go back to Sia, I can probably guarantee one of the biggest problems he has is that when you start getting problems with your equipment, there's no tool and die makers, there's no electrical engineers, there's no skills out there to support this initiative because everybody wants an office job. We've got to change that mindset. There aren't any office jobs. If you think that's what's going to happen, you're going to be unemployed the rest of your life. Change your mindset. Get your hands dirty, start looking and seeing what you can do on real applications. So entrepreneurial application is where people need to understand how this can unpack a problem into an opportunity. And that's where not everybody is born an entrepreneur, but we need to be able to encourage entrepreneurial thinking that, government is not going to create jobs. But if you look at creating supply chain opportunities, we can have a whole host of opportunities there. Zero waste by 2030. What a joke. Not going to happen. So it's not happened in, they're now looking at maybe by 2050 in Europe, and Europe has way more resources than we do. We had another initiative when we looked at, there was another agreement that we signed, I can't even remember the name of it, it's so long ago, where the at that stage, DEA, Environmental Affairs, had committed to 25% landfill diversion by 2012. Okay, so by 2012, we had to reduce our 2005 numbers to 25% less by 2012. By 2012, we'd actually increased it by 45%, not reduced it by 25%. So what do? We changed the goalposts and we said, okay, well, let's look at the next 5 or 10 years and see what we can do there. Have we achieved that? No. So there's a lot of things that are going on there, but if they don't open up these opportunities like we've been chatting about, it's never going to happen. That's why we've got to stop the talk and get on to the action. And the EPR, it's a bit of a mess, I'm afraid. I'm very happy that it's moved away from government as a Section 28, which Boyisa, IBAG and Redisa were 2 key opportunities of understanding how not to get government to do it. But now we have industry driving it, and I'm fear that industry may be looking after industry's best interests as opposed to the real opportunities and requirements. We don't know that yet. We will see as that pans out. There are different people at different sectors looking at different components of EPR. Some may work, some may not. So it's a learning curve, but I think it's an essential component to bring that mandated responsibility in, that we can start to look at it, measure it, monitor it, and then we'll see what goes from there. I think I answered everything. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. Colleagues, we've come to the end of the Q&A and off to the last item of this discussion, which is the vote of thanks. So from my side, Chris, and also from the MBDA group, we would like to thank you for such an informative engagement. You looked at many aspects pertaining to circular economy, especially when you were mentioning circular economy and waste management as one of the pillars mentioned, and how it could support the development of new industries and jobs, reducing emissions and increasing efficient use of natural resources, including energy, water, and materials. So thank you so much for the engagement. As you were mentioning circular economy and food security, especially how you interlocked that with pollution too. And we all know that research has shown that the quality of nutritional chain has been steadily declining as a direct result of the negative effects of pollution-intensive agricultural practices and the need to increase food production. So thank you so much for sharing and highlighting the food chain potential solutions and current challenges towards the new economic pattern, but also the mentioning, of the work already done by local organizations in that regard, and also the work that needs to be done in order for there to be circular economic transformation. Also, a huge gratitude to the MBDA team for putting this conversation together. I echo the comments on the chats as well, the comments on the social media pages, thanking the MBDA for bringing in such informative and impactful discussion. Please remember to leave your email address if you would like to be part of the hashtag MBDA Conversations webinar. We would also not have an engagement without different communities that have joined us today. Those present here in this platform, those listening on radio, those joining on our social media pages as well. So thank you for bringing in your high energies, suggestions, questions, and a way forward. And then particularly the questions that forced us all to reflect. Thank you, colleagues. Keep following the MBDA website and social media pages. Remember, this conversation is archived on Facebook and YouTube. So do follow the MBDA Facebook page as well as the YouTube page to get more other archived conversations that are similar to this one. Have a great day. So goodbye.
Thank you, Program Director. Bye.